Coming to you from the Pacific Northwest, this is Mythic Radio.
The first time it happened, I was sleeping and woke up because I felt a hand on my leg and I realized that I couldn't move.
And he come across this object on the ground, which was the shape of a flying saucer. So he jumped out of his pickup and went down there, and there was 4 beings laying on the ground.
When I raised my head back up, I was turning my head, and out of my peripheral vision, I seen something hop to a tree. And it was tall, about 7, 8 foot tall, and it was black, real hairy, like a gorilla.
The first thing we saw was this winged creature, 14-foot wingspan at least. It was huge. It almost covered half the road.
Welcome to Mythic Radio, everybody. I'm your host, Nick. Thank you so much for joining me today. This is episode 1 of Mythic Radio. Today is May 6th, 2017. I appreciate you being here with me. First thing, and really the main thing we're talking about today, is a story that is very strange, to say the least. It happened on January 25th, 1959. At least that's when it started, I should say. We're going to talk about the Dyatlov Pass incident. This is a story that involved 10 hikers, and they traveled into the Ural Mountains, formerly the Soviet Union. They were from the Ural Polytechnic Institute. And this is a very odd story for many different reasons. And today, we're just going to cover the facts. We're not going to talk about anything that's speculation or anything of that nature. I just want you guys, if you're unaware of this story, I want to shed some light on it. And I definitely want to urge you to go and do your own research on this story and form your own opinion. So that said, let's get into it. So January 25th, 1959, 10 backpackers/skiers embark on their journey to the Ural Mountains. And right before they start their actual expedition portion of this trip, one of the hikers falls ill. He stays behind. And then there were 9. So these 9 backpackers and hikers, they are heading toward a particular point that they are trying to get to by a certain date. That date was February 11th, 1959. They were supposed to get into their base camp. They were traveling through sub-zero temperatures at night, and when the 11th of February, 1959, comes around, they were supposed to check in with their loved ones. Telegrams were supposed to be sent. Nothing was received. So, at this point, the family members of these hikers decide, well, we're going to give them a few more days because we understand that inclement weather and natural weather conditions can have effects. They're probably okay. We'll just give them another week. So fast forward a week later, they still have not heard anything from their loved ones. So they demand that the institute where the students are from start a complete investigation. So they do. The school puts together a civilian and eventually a military search party. And they go into the Urals, and what they discover is horrifying, to say the least, and very, very, very strange. In a nutshell, what we find is that the tent is completely destroyed. Not only is the tent destroyed, but it appears that these hikers, at some point in the night, in sub-zero temperatures, cut themselves out of this tent and fled. Now, if that's not strange enough, the condition in which their bodies were found is even stranger. Multiple hikers that fled the tent fled without any clothes on. Some fled with no shoes, some fled with socks, some fled with one shoe and on one foot, and, etc. Some of the hikers were found fully clothed, but wearing others' clothing from other hikers, ripped clothing that appeared that they had cut or torn the clothing off of their deceased compatriots. Lots of different strange events. 2 of the backpackers were found very near the tent, but under a large pine tree. These 2 hikers were found next to what appeared to be a campfire that they had built. Yet both hikers appeared to have died from hypothermia. Also, what was strange about this particular area where these 2 hikers were, this tree that they were found under had missing branches about 15 feet from the base of the tree, about 15 feet up the trunk of the tree. All the branches had been pulled off. And when they investigated the tree more closely, they found that flesh from the hands of these hikers, these 2 hikers, the flesh was embedded in the tree trunk, as if they tried climbing the tree to get away from something. That's the idea that the investigators had, the searchers. So then, of course, they looked at the hands of these 2 hikers, and sure enough, their hands were just completely destroyed from trying to clamber up this tree. Other hikers were found in small groups. 4 of the other hikers were found in a makeshift trench, and they were all suffering from what appeared to be some sort of internal blunt force trauma. The odd thing about those hikers, that particular group, was that their skin did not show any sign of blunt force trauma. It was just internal, nothing external. And so they discovered this when they did autopsies. They did autopsies on all of these hikers and found that this was very odd in a lot of different ways. Then the other group of hikers that had fled in a third direction, they were found on their backs. Some of them were found in positions that looked as though they were trying to go back to the tent. And one of the female hikers in that particular group that had fled was found on her back with her mouth frozen open, and her tongue had been ripped out or eaten out, possibly from the fauna that maybe inhabited the area, or bacteria. Who knows? There was a lot of speculation there. So also they determined that her eyes were missing. So these hikers fled the tent in all sorts of degrees of undress, in sub-zero temperatures, very, very odd conditions. So I'm leaving a lot of small details out because I wanted to just give you guys the overall picture of what really happened here. Everything I have said and talked about is stuff that was documented by the search party, the civilian search party, and the military search party, I should say. Documented and is true. I have not discussed anything that has happened after the fact, because there's been a lot of folks that have kind of come up with some interesting takes on what they think has happened or what happened. One of the other strange things that apparently occurred was that after these poor deceased folks were brought back into town and they had the coroner look at them, they had autopsies done, The relatives at the funeral all stated, or most of them stated, that they believed that the skin of these deceased hikers had an orangey glow to them. And apparently the hair on the corpses had turned gray. The other strange thing is that when they were doing the autopsies and investigation on the bodies, they also did investigations, or I should say they took samples of the clothing of these hikers, and the clothing showed significant signs of radiation. Okay, that's weird. So, a couple months later, down the road, after the funerals have happened, a group of backpackers claim that on the night in question, that all these other hikers perished, that they were backpacking about 32 miles south, and they saw what appeared to be lights in the northern sky that were orange in color, and they couldn't explain what they looked like. They looked like some sort of orb in the sky. So then you start to get into this discussion where there's people that think, well, maybe it's something extraterrestrial that happened to these folks. Why do their clothes have radiation on them? Why did they leave a perfectly good tent and cut themselves out of it rather than just unclasping the door to the tent and running out? Why are they all in different forms of undress, you might ask? Lots of different theories, lots of different questions. In the coming weeks, I want to talk more about this incident. I would love if you guys would check out my website, mythicradio.com. I've got a forum up there. Feel free to start a new topic on this. I might start a topic, and feel free to put your 2 cents in there about what it is you think really might have happened here. I really want to hear your thoughts. I'm very interested to hear people's opinions on this. And it doesn't matter what you think. I want to hear it. I, in no way, shape, or form, have made up my mind on what has happened. I definitely think that there's some very odd things, and I don't think all of it can be explained away. Apparently, this area on the mountain was not a place where avalanches typically occurred. So avalanche was definitely something that I was curious about. But apparently, the professional search team that came said that there were no signs actually of an avalanche. So that's curious as well. But there's a lot of different questions that we are going to continue to talk about over the next couple of weeks. We're going to stay on this topic. And I really, really think it's going to be pretty exciting to hear what you guys have to say about it. So please don't hesitate to leave a comment, no matter where you're listening, whether it's here on Spreaker or someplace else. We are syndicated in a lot of different areas. MythicRadio.com. We've got some buttons, some links on there for you guys to find where we are on social media as well. So please follow us so that you know when we drop another podcast for you. So we're going to continue to give you guys the best quality product that we can make, and we love this stuff, and we hope you do too. So anyway, we appreciate the support, guys, and we will see you on the next episode of Mythic Radio. Take care. Coming to you from the Pacific Northwest, this is Mythic Radio.
The first time it happened, I was sleeping and woke up because I felt a hand on my leg, and I realized that I couldn't move.
And he come across this object on the ground, which was the shape of a flying saucer. So he jumped out of his pickup and went down there, and there was 4 beings laying on the ground.
When I raised my head back up, I was turning my head, and out of my peripheral vision, I seen something hop to a tree. And it was tall, about 7, 8 foot tall, and it was black, real hairy, like a gorilla.
first thing we saw was this winged creature, 14-foot wingspan at least. It was huge. It almost covered half the road.
Welcome to Mythic Radio, everyone. Hope everyone's having a great Sunday. It is May the 14th. It's Mother's Day. Hello and welcome, and thank you to all the wonderful mothers out there. Hope you know how much you are loved and appreciated today, as you are every day. I hope everyone's having a wonderful day wherever you're listening from. It's actually quite a beautiful day here in the Pacific Northwest. So anyway, I want to thank you guys for listening and for being here with me today. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about the Dyatlov Pass incident that occurred. This is going to be rehashing a little bit of what we already talked about. But if you have not listened to part one, please do so. Over on Spreaker or SoundCloud, you can find it there. And it should be right below it in the playlist if you're listening to this. So find that there. Also, go check out mythicradio.com. You can click on the Tell Your Story link there. If you have a strange encounter or occurrence that you have witnessed or experienced yourself, you can tell us what exactly happened there, ask questions, things like that. We also have a forum over on mythicradio.com that you can join and start your own thread if you would like to do so. And hopefully we can grow the community a little bit. So that would be awesome. So anyway, over on Twitter, you can find us, Mythic Radio Live. Also over on Instagram, Mythic Radio Live. So getting into it, we are going to discuss just a couple of the things. One in particular that I've been doing more research on, having to do with this incident. And there's actually a plausible explanation, I guess, that some folks have come up with. So just to kind of recap, these 9 hikers went into the Ural Mountains, and they were on a ski trip, and when they were supposed to contact their relatives a few days later, they did not. A search team was put together to go and find these folks, and when they got to the mountain, they did not expect to find what they found, and which was that all 9 hikers had perished. And so, in a very, very, very small nutshell, the different ways that these hikers were found was very odd and frightening. As I said, you can check out all the other details in part 1. But what we're discussing right now is kind of some of the weird things that were experienced, the way that these hikers looked, what they were wearing or what they weren't wearing, and some of the reasons behind that. So one of the theories behind this is that, so on the mountain when they were found, some of the hikers had some internal damage done, but apparently their skin did not really show any damage, so there's kind of some speculation there. But what a lot of people think happened was, plain and simple, was an avalanche. This area, though, was not supposedly a high-risk location for avalanches, but that is still probably the biggest cause that most people believe, created this damage to the tent and to the hikers themselves. There's also something called paradoxical undressing, which has to do with, at a certain point, you go through hypothermia, your brain actually starts to freeze, if I understand it correctly. You guys can correct me if I'm wrong, where you're just not thinking straight, and your brain is actually telling you that you are actually overheating when you're actually freezing, and so on and so forth. So paradoxical undressing, that they call it, could be an explanation for why a lot of the hikers were outside of the tent with no clothes on or partially dressed and not even in their own clothes and things like that, of that nature. So one of the other weird things that I more recently came across is something called infrasound theory. So apparently the mountain that they were on, there's the topography of the mountain. There's a possibility that it could have produced some sort of repetitive wind noise or a wind event. And apparently this particular, it's like a low frequency sound that apparently will trigger panic-inducing activity or reaction, I should say. So depending on what the weather was doing, what the wind was doing, could have created this low-pitched hum that you don't even realize that you hear it, apparently. And it could have triggered, I guess, feelings of terror and unease. And apparently it's explained, or I should say it's not explained any other way, except this sound wave is too low for your actual ear to realize that it's hearing, but it can produce feelings of absolute fear, in which case it could make these hikers run out of their tent, and possibly then with the cold. So here's what I don't understand is that, so when they were in the tent, I'm assuming they were warmer. They were, in their bunks, maybe. So they weren't freezing at that point. So what would have made them run out of the tent half naked? It's not like they ran out of the tent fully clothed and then stripped. So that's what I'm curious about. The other thing is, okay, well, you say, well, maybe they heard this low pitch noise that they didn't realize they were hearing, but then all of a sudden it caused them to have fear, and they didn't know why, and they thought maybe they started becoming more paranoid, and they thought that people in the tent were going to hurt them, and so they decided to run out. Again, we found out earlier that it appeared that they had cut themselves out of the tent, which is very strange. So anyway, make your own conclusion on that. I don't know. As I mentioned before, people have discussed that they think that there was some radiation that was found, apparently, in the investigation on their clothes. And apparently at the funeral, a lot of the family members claimed that their skin was orange or had an orangey glow. But others have also said that is hearsay and that was not actually what happened, that was something that people added in after the fact. So, who knows? Also, that their hair turned white. That was something else that went along with the whole skin looking orange and all that. So those two things are up in the air. I wouldn't say that those are actually truths that you can document. That's more of what people have said as the story has been online and things like that. But these hikers' relatives, this is something that they claimed. So, let's see. And then the other possibilities was that the Mansi tribe that was in the nearby mountains was unhappy with the fact that these hikers were close within their territory, and that they, maybe somehow snuck up on the camp and ordered them out at gunpoint. Again, none of them had any bullet wounds. There were no other footprints in the snow. There were no animal tracks. So, that's a big, what if. The other thing was that one of the female hikers was found with her mouth open and her tongue was gone. Some claimed that it looked like the tongue had been ripped out. Some claimed that the tongue had been cut out. Also, her eyes were missing. So, all these things, in one way or another, the best way I describe this story is that if you take each individual occurrence, there seems to be a very plausible explanation for each individual occurrence that happened. But what I find odd is that when you start looking at everything together, that's when this gets really strange. And things kind of start to overlap, and you realize that, well, that made sense at first, but then what about this? Oh, and then that happened? Oh, so stuff continues to compound on top of these different theories, and I don't know, it's just weird. I'm not saying that I think it was something paranormal or supernatural, or that it was something evil or what have you, but it's definitely curious. And again, feel free in the comments below to throw whatever you think in there. Hey, you're crazy. This is obviously scientific, nothing supernatural about it. Or if you think that it was something from above, that you can share that too. So tell me what you think. So the other thing that we talked about briefly in part one was the fact that apparently a group of hikers that were about 32 miles south apparently saw some lights in the sky, which would have been over where this Dyatlov Pass incident actually happened. So some people think that maybe it was something extraterrestrial that caused the radiation and all this. So, this is something that I want to keep talking about in the future, and I want to get more feedback from you guys on it. And if I find anything different online, or I hear another story or another take on it, I will definitely share it with you guys. But, as far as the Dyatlov Pass incident goes, I'm going to leave it at that. And next week on the show, what I really want to talk about, the topic, is going to be very strange as well. We're going to be talking about black-eyed children. Not black-eyed peas. Black-eyed children. Very strange occurrences where people encounter these children, usually in groups of 2 or more, between the ages of 6 and 16, coming to people's doors, asking to get in. We'll delve into it more, but just to give you guys a quick little origin, it started back in the 1990s. And people all over the world actually are now experiencing this strange phenomena where they might be sitting in the car, might be at home, and they get a knock on the door, and there's weird children out there, and there's an ominous feeling that comes with them. So anyway, guys, thanks again for joining me. Appreciate the support, and we'll talk to you more next week here on Mythic Radio. Take care, guys. Coming to you from the Pacific Northwest, you're listening to Mythic Radio.
The first time it happened, I was sleeping and woke up because I felt a hand on my leg, and I realized that I couldn't move.
And he come across this object on the ground, which was the shape of a flying saucer. So he jumped out of his pickup and went down there, and there was 4 beings laying on the ground.
When I raised my head back up, I was turning my head, and out of my peripheral vision, I seen something hop to a tree. And it was tall, about 7, 8 foot tall, and it was black, real hairy, like a gorilla.
First thing we saw was this winged creature, 14-foot wingspan at least. It was huge. It almost covered half the road.
Welcome to Mythic Radio, everybody. I'm your host, Nick. Thank you for tuning in. Today is May 24th, and this is episode number 3. You can visit us over at mythicradio.com and share your own experiences by clicking on the Tell Your Story link. We'll share your story right here on the podcast. You can also get involved by joining our forums at mythicradio.com and by following us across all social media at Mythic Radio Live. Our topic on the show today is black-eyed children, or black-eyed kids, also known as BEK. I appreciate you sticking with me. I've been trying to get this episode out for quite a while now, and I'm very excited to do so. So what we're going to talk about is first the origins, and then I'm going to relay a couple of stories that I've found. And I think you'll find them very interesting. If you don't know what black-eyed children are, it's something that everyone should learn a little bit about. Whether it be an urban legend or not, it's definitely creepy. The origins of the black-eyed children. The supposed origins of the legend are from postings in 1998 written by Texas reporter Brian Bethel on a ghost-related mailing list relating 2 alleged encounters with black-eyed kids. Bethel describes encountering 2 such children in Abilene, Texas in 1996, and claims that a second person had a similar unrelated encounter in Portland, Oregon in 2012. Brian Bethel told his story on the reality television series Monsters and Mysteries in America. He wrote a follow-up article for the Abilene Reporter News describing his experience and maintaining his belief that it was legitimate. This is his story. In 1996, he was on his way to pay an internet bill at a local provider's office. He pulled over near a movie theater using the marquee's light to write a check. It was in this moment when a knock frightened him, a pair of pale knuckles tapping his driver's side window. Bethel looked up to see two young boys with hooded sweatshirts covering their faces. An immense rush of fear suddenly came over him. The fear, as Bethel remembered, was incomprehensible at the time. The boy, who seemed to be the leader of the two, had curly hair and an olive complexion. The other boys stood in the background, red hair and freckles. Their appearance, though average at first glance, soon sent even more fear through his bones. The boys both had eyes that lacked any substance. They were just large swaths of pitch black. No life whatsoever. Frozen in his car, Bethel listened as the leader asked if they could have a ride to their mother's house. They wanted to get money to see a movie at the nearby theater. "It won't take long," the boy assured Bethel. "We're just kids." The boy would continue. Though these words were perhaps meant to ease Bethel's obvious terror, it only made him panic even more. He rolled the window up and put the car in reverse, ready to drive off. The boy yelled at him through the window of the car, "We can't come in unless you tell us it's okay. Let us in." He drove away, quickly glancing one more time for the boys, but he saw nothing. Within seconds, they had completely disappeared out of sight. So regarding how people always see and encounter these black-eyed kids, black-eyed children, I'm going to go over some of the basic signs that people encounter. So this is what the majority of people see. Black-eyed children supposedly resemble kids between the ages of about 6 to 16 and usually arrive in pairs. They typically appear at night when they show up at the doors of unsuspecting residents and ask to use the bathroom, make a phone call, or grab something to eat. They have also been seen on buses, city streets, and in parking lots asking for a ride, such as Bethel encountered. It is common for only one of the children to do the talking, while the other child hangs its head as though not to show too much of its face. Once people open their door, they realize that the eyes of these so-called children are completely black. It is reported that they usually show themselves to adults rather than children. Their clothing and haircuts may appear odd or out of place in some instances, but in others, they appear fairly normal. People that encounter them all describe a feeling of fear and complete and utter dread while the black-eyed children are present, even before making verbal contact with the black-eyed children. So what we have is a very odd phenomena happening, starting back in 1996, as I said. And you can make your own conclusion, of course. I'm still making mine. But now I'm going to read to you a couple different stories. And the stories that I'm going to read did not state who wrote them. They were on kind of a generic forum. But I found these two to be very interesting. The first one is kind of a standard textbook encounter. The second one is actually a supposed encounter where the subject actually let them into her house, and it kind of tells what she experienced after that. So the first one is called Halloween. It had been a slow trick-or-treat night in our neighborhood that evening, which is pretty odd in itself. We usually have kids from different areas dropped off in ours, and have a constant parade at our door. That night, I'd say we'd had no more than 8 or 10 groups of kids come by the entire night. It was about 9:30 p.m., and my husband and I were sitting in our family room watching some of those ghost shows based on supposedly actual events. Like I said, I don't believe in that stuff, but I do like a good ghost story now and then, and it was Halloween and all. We hadn't had any activity at the door in over half an hour, and it was getting late, so we decided to turn the porch light off and let our dog, Chloe, out of her crate. Chloe is an American bulldog and is very docile. We only put her in her crate because we were afraid she'd try to get out and play with all of the kids, and I didn't want to have to chase her down the street. Also, we didn't want her to scare any of the kids because she would look a little intimidating to younger kids. So I turned the outside light off, let Chloe out of her cage, and she followed me back to the couch and laid down at my feet. It was getting close to 10 p.m. when my husband decided he'd had enough fun for the night and was going to go upstairs, take a shower, and get ready for bed. After all, it was Thursday, and he still had to get up early the next day. My teenage son was out with his friends at a local haunted house and wasn't expected back for another hour or so. So that left me alone on the couch with Chloe. Now, just because I don't believe doesn't mean those shows don't freak me out a bit. And being alone, now watching, I'd have to say, was kind of on edge. It wasn't long after I heard the upstairs water for the shower turn on when there came a light knock, knock, knock at the front door. My initial reaction was, what the hell, really? It's almost 10, go home. But soon an uneasy feeling came over me. Why the knock? Our doorbell glows, and in the dark and without the porch light, it would be extra obvious to anyone there. I paused. I couldn't really just ignore it. Our front door has a big beveled window. A beveled glass window, I should say, and anybody right at the door could see in enough to see someone was in the family room watching TV. It would be pretty rude for me to just sit there and not answer it. Knock, 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 again from the door. I glanced down at Chloe, and she was gone. My gaze followed her usual path to the front door, expecting her to be on her way, as she usually does. Nothing. She wasn't there. I stood up to look around the room better and found her, crouching by the back door like she wanted to go out. However, she never asks to go out like that. She always comes and licks my hand and puts her head on my knee. This was totally out of character for her, and I have to say it heightened my anxiety. "Chloe, crate," I said. She just turned back and looked at me like, "Hell no, lady, I ain't moving." I yelled up to my husband, but if he was already in the shower, I knew there was no chance of him hearing me. Knock, knock, knock. About the time a car drove down our street and cast just enough light on the door to where I could see the silhouettes of 2 small children through the glass, I instantly felt relief. It was just some kids, probably, a couple of my neighbors, on their way back home that wanted to stop by and show me their costume or something. I headed to the door and looked back to make sure Chloe wasn't going to follow me. What a great watchdog, I thought to myself, as she just sat there. I turned on the porch light when I got to the door, and sure enough, I could see through the glass that it was a couple of pretty small kids. A little late for such young ones, I thought, and I began to wonder about what kind of parents would let their kids run the streets that late at night. I only opened the door enough to where I could block Chloe's escape, which was only about 2 feet that I opened the door. What struck me immediately as odd was the kids weren't wearing any costumes. They were in normal street clothes. Also, no customary trick-or-treat either. I began to feel very uneasy again. It was a girl and a boy. The girl to my left was older. I'd say about 11 or 12. I could tell that she was blonde, but I couldn't make out any distinct features as our lights are from behind and high above on the columns at the front door, so most of the light was coming from behind them. I had not opened the door wide enough for any light from inside to hit them directly. The boy was younger and about a foot shorter. I'd say about 8 or 9, and he looked to have light brown hair. The girl very politely spoke up. "Ma'am, can I please come in and use your phone to call our mom?" As she spoke, something in the pit of my stomach was telling me something was wrong. What kid, even at that age, doesn't have a cell phone of their own these days? I couldn't remember the last time I'd had anybody ask me to use my home phone. Hun, don't you have a phone of your own you can call your mom?" I asked. This was when things got weird. Both kids turned to look at one another, like they were going to say something to one another, but never ever spoke. They both turned back to me, and the girl said, "Ma'am, my cell phone battery doesn't have any charge left in it. Can we please come inside and call our mother? We're alone out here, and my brother is scared." I have to admit, there were two competing feelings going on inside me. The first, that of a mother's heart that wanted to help these two small children get to their mom. The other was a sinking fear in my gut that was keeping the other feeling at bay. It was then I noticed that during the short conversation, I had already opened the door a few extra inches, which I was completely unaware of doing. I stopped. "Honey, why don't you give me your mother's number, and I can call her myself," I said. Another pause, and they look again at each other. After a short moment, they turned back to me, and the girl said, "Ma'am, my little brother has to use your bathroom. Can we please come in while you call our mom?" And with that last statement, the little girl moved closer toward the door, like she was just going to walk on by me. As she did, she stepped into the light coming from inside the house, and I got my first real good look at her. Solid, jet black eyes. That's all I could see. That motherly instinct was gone and replaced by terror. I don't think I've ever felt this terror in my life. I could feel every hair on my arm and back standing straight on end. I closed the door to where just my face was able to stick out. The little girl stopped and again pleaded, "Please, ma'am, we're really scared and alone out here. We have to come inside. Please help us." Then, like on cue, both kids began to whimper and cry. That's when the fear took hold, and I shut and locked the door. "I'll call your mom if you give me the number," I shouted through the door, "but I'm not letting you in my house." I could still see them, just standing on the porch, just staring at me through the beveled glass pane. Part of me wanted to run upstairs to my husband, but the bigger part didn't want to lose track of where these kids were. That would have freaked me out even more to not know where they went. After what seemed like forever, but probably only a few seconds, I decided I'd call my neighbor that lives across the street. As I made my way to the side table by our couch to my phone, I glanced back at the door. Chloe was nowhere to be found. We later found her in the guest room under the bed. When I got to my phone and started to look for his contact info, my neighbor, it was only then the kids stepped away from the door and began to walk to the street. As they did, I walked to the door to get a better look to see where they went, still not calling my neighbor yet. If you get close enough to the glass, you can see out enough to make out people's shapes, but you can't see much detail. Of course, standing that close to the door would make you pretty obvious to anyone outside looking in. From the door, I could see that the kids were still standing under the street lamp nearest my house, staring at me. As I lifted the phone to my ear after calling, only then did the kids start walking down our street. I met my neighbor out under the lamp once he was out there, but the kids were nowhere to be seen. Like I said, I don't believe in any of this stuff, and I had never even heard about black-eyed kids before talking to my friend. But what I really think, what I have to think, is these kids were just out yanking people's chains on Halloween night. But I will say they were good, really good. They scared the crap out of me and my dog. So that's just one encounter where we have a skeptic that is looking at it very intelligently, that it's probably just some kids that are up to some tricks. I'm going to read you one more quick story. This is the story of what happened when some folks let the kids in their home. The title of this one is I Let the Black-Eyed Children Inside My House. I live just outside of a rural town in Vermont. It's a tight-knit community where everyone knows one another, and people don't lock their doors at night. There has never been any need to. A little over a year ago, I woke up because I heard a loud banging on my front door. At the time, my husband and I lived in a small home on a dirt road just off the rural route into town. It was the middle of a snowstorm, and the nearby hills get very slippery in the snow, so I thought that someone might have been in an accident and broken down. It's happened before. When I looked out the window, I could see that our motion spotlight was on. I could see that there were footprints in the snow that had come from our road and into our driveway, but there was no car anywhere. The snow was still covering the road, and no one had driven on it for at least a couple hours. Our front door was obscured from the window, but I could see that someone was standing there. I wasn't sure what to think, so I woke my husband up just to feel safer. While I was telling him what was going on, the banging on the door started again, and my husband went to answer it while I stood in the hallway. When he opened the door, there were two children standing in the snow, looking toward the ground. They were a boy and a girl, and could not have been more than 8 years old. They were dressed strangely, and had odd haircuts. The girl's hair was very long and straight, and the boy had a dated haircut that looked almost like a bowl cut. They weren't dressed for winter, and my first thought was that they must have been Mennonite children. But as far as I know, there was never a large community of Mennonites near us. Thinking back on it, I know that my normal reaction to seeing children in a snowstorm would have been to rush them inside and bundle them up with some blankets and hot cocoa. But that's not how this felt. The children were very unnerving. They would not make eye contact, and when my husband asked them if everything was okay, they asked if they could come in. My husband looked at me like, "What do I do?" And I asked the kids where their parents were. "They'll be here soon," is all the kids said. It was around 2 o'clock in the morning at this point, so the only reasonable thought in my head was that there must have been an accident or these kids got lost. As much as my instincts told me not to bring them inside, I did it anyway. I went into the kitchen to make them some hot cocoa, while my husband took them into the living room. While I was fixing the kettle, I could hear my husband talking to the kids. He was asking them if they were okay, where they came from, how far they walked, if their parents' car was broken down, things like that. But they always answered, "Our parents will be here soon." They spoke in a sing-song voice. They weren't afraid to be in a stranger's home at all. I started to notice that our cats, which we had 4 of, were all hiding, except Pigeon. Pigeon was in the kitchen with me. Normally our cats are very curious and friendly when we have to be careful that they don't run out the door when we leave. This time, none of them tried to see who was here, which I thought was very strange. All of the hair on Pigeon's neck was standing up on his tail and was puffed up while he looked into the living room. When I bent down to pet him and see what was wrong, he hissed and started growling and backing up until he had himself under the kitchen island. I have never seen him do that before. When I walked back into the living room, the kids were sitting on the couch, as still as can be, but my husband was holding his head in his hands. I asked him what was wrong, and he just said that he felt very dizzy, all of a sudden, but that he was fine. I turned back to the children to give them their cocoa, but when they looked at me, I gasped. It took everything inside me not to drop the mugs and run away. When they looked at me, their eyes were completely black. They had no whites, just giant black pupils. When they saw that I was scared, they stood up and asked if they could use the bathroom. I tried to be as composed as I could be and showed them down the hall. They went into the bathroom together, and I hurried back to my husband and asked him if he had seen their eyes. He had seen them too, and said that it looked like his brother's badly bruised eyes after a car accident. We were in the middle of talking about whose children they could be when my husband's nose started to bleed. He'd never had nosebleeds as long as I had known him. I just knew inside myself that this had something to do with the kids in the bathroom, and I started crying while I ran to get some tissues for my husband. That's when the power went out. I heard my husband yell my name from the living room. As I started to walk back through the hallway, I stopped dead in my tracks. The two kids were standing at the end of the hall. They weren't moving, and I had never been so scared in my whole life. They just stood there in the dark. After what felt like forever, the boy said, "Our parents are here." And they walked to the door, opened it, and walked out, leaving the door wide open. My husband jumped up to go close it and almost fell over. We looked out the window and saw two men standing by a black car idling at the end of our driveway. The men looked like they were wearing black-colored suits and were very tall, at least 6 feet. When my husband waved at them, they just stared at us, got into the car, and drove off. Our power to the house came back on after about a half hour, but nothing was the same after that. Over the next few months, 3 of our cats went missing. We can only assume that they ran away and never came back, but the worst thing was coming home to find Pigeon in a puddle of blood on the living room floor. He looked like he had been vomiting blood. The vet told us that he had some kind of hemorrhage. After my husband's nosebleeds became a regular occurrence, we went to see the doctor. He didn't know what to make of it, other than dry nasal passages, but my husband was diagnosed with an aggressive skin cancer. When the doctor asked us if he used tanning beds, we both thought he was joking, but apparently this kind of melanoma is linked to overuse of indoor tanning beds. The doctors think he will recover, but don't understand how it got so bad so quickly. My husband has never worked an outdoor job and spends relatively little time in the sun. Since we let the black-eyed kids inside our home, I've also suffered from regular dizzy spells and nosebleeds on a regular basis. I've had other issues which I won't mention here, but trust me when I say that I am suddenly in the worst condition of my life, and no one can do anything about it. I know that all of this is because I let the black-eyed children into my home. We've told everyone we could about the strange kids that showed up that night, but no one else saw them, and some laugh at how scared we were of the Mennonite kids. But we know what we saw. I wish my husband had never opened that door. A very interesting tale, and it really makes you stop and think, is it some sort of entity? Is it kids just being kids? Very odd if this story is true, that it happened in a snowstorm, not a typical place that you would find children. What are these things? What are they doing? And why do they want to come into your home or your car? What's the point? You might wonder, are they ghosts? What are they? Are they some sort of evil entity? Some people have speculated that the black-eyed children are extraterrestrials or even alien-human hybrids. Some insist that they are some classification of ghost or spirit manifesting itself in order to complete a malevolent act. Black-eyed children have also thought to be vampires, but this is one of the less popular theories. I would say that no matter what you call them, all who encounter them seem to agree that they are harbingers of ill will and personal doom. I'd like to thank everyone for joining me today, and I want to encourage you to visit our forums on mythicradio.com. There you'll find all the topics that we discuss here on the podcast. Feel free to ask questions, post your own experiences, and start a new topic on what interests you. So guys, thanks again. I hope to see you back here on the next episode, and I really want you to know how much I appreciate the support and all of the downloads and the views and the likes. It really helps us to continue doing what we're doing. So have a great day, and we'll see you next time. Coming to you from the Pacific Northwest, you're listening to Mythic Radio.
The first time it happened, I was sleeping and woke up because I felt a hand on my leg, and I realized that I couldn't move.
And he come across this object on the ground, which was the shape of a flying saucer. So he jumped out of his pickup and went down there, and there was 4 beings laying on the ground.
When I raised my head back up, I was turning my head, and out of my peripheral vision, I seen something hop to a tree. And it was tall, about 7, 8 foot tall, and it was black, real hairy, like a gorilla.
First thing we saw was this winged creature, 14-foot wingspan at least. It was huge. It almost covered half the road.
Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Nick. Thank you for tuning in. Today is Sunday, June 4th, and this is episode 4. You can visit us over on mythicradio.com and share your own experiences by clicking on the Tell Your Story link. We'll share your story right here on the podcast. You can also get involved by joining our forums at mythicradio.com and by following us across all social media at Mythic Radio Live. Don't forget, you can also find Mythic Radio Podcast on Spreaker, iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, and YouTube. On today's show, we're talking about recent sightings in Chicago, Illinois. People are witnessing a hairy, bat-like humanoid creature near the parks and bridges of the Windy City. These sightings started occurring during mid-April 2017 and have continued through May 2017. I'm going to read a few of the eyewitness accounts, but before I do, I want to take you back to 1966 in order to explain the significance of these current sightings. On November 12, 1966, a winged humanoid dubbed the Mothman by the media was sighted in the small town of Point Pleasant, West Virginia. Mothman is said to be 7 or 8 feet tall with a 10 to 15 foot wingspan, dark brown or black fur, and glowing red eyes. The creature was encountered on multiple occasions throughout 1966 and 1967, leading up to the collapse of the Silver Bridge in Point Pleasant. The Silver Bridge was built in 1928 and connected Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and Gallipolis, Ohio. On December 15, 1967, the Silver Bridge collapsed without warning into the Ohio River during rush hour, killing 46 people. It was one of the worst catastrophes in American history. Many people believe that the Mothman had a direct connection to the collapse of the Silver Bridge. The Mothman has been seen all over the world by people of all walks of life. In most cases, some form of catastrophe follows the alleged sightings of the Mothman. Now, as we turn back to these sightings that are currently taking place in Chicago, Illinois, a lot of people are seeing similarities to the events that happened 51 years ago in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. Is this a warning that some sort of tragedy may occur in the following months? Or is it just a hoax being created to perpetuate the myth of the Mothman? As I read the eyewitness reports, I'll let you decide. The first witness was out on Lake Michigan with her husband and 2 other couples celebrating a friend's birthday. She said, "We were about 2 miles out on the lake, just off of Montrose, at about 10 p.m. We were enjoying ourselves when I happened to look up and I saw what looked like a giant bat, and not like a fox bat. This bat was as tall as my husband, who is 6 foot 4 inches or even bigger. She said it was solid black, with eyes that seemed to reflect the moonlight. She added, "This bat circled the boat 3 times in complete silence before heading off toward Montrose. It quickly blended into the night sky and was gone in seconds. About 5 minutes after seeing the creature, the same witness saw a bright green object traveling north to south at the horizon. She said, I began feeling this overwhelming sensation of dread and told my husband that I felt that it would be prudent to get off the water as quickly as possible." The following eyewitness report was published on April 10th, 2017. I'm writing this out after taking a day or two to really think if I wanted to report this and tell others what I saw the other night in Oz Park here in Chicago. I finally decided that writing this out and submitting it would be therapeutic to me and might hopefully help identify what it was that I saw and maybe help someone else avoid the same thing. I live in the Lincoln Park neighborhood in the city of Chicago, and I live about 1.5 blocks from Oz Park. When the weather is nice, I usually go outdoors and to the park to jog and walk my dog. The night of April 7th was no different. It was mild and the cold weather had finally subsided, so I decided to give the treadmill a break and go outside to jog and let the dog get some fresh air. As I came to the corner of Burling Street and Webster Avenue, where I crossed the street to the park, my dog began acting very peculiar and acted like she didn't want to go to the park. This is very strange, as usually my dog goes absolutely nuts when we go to the park and has the time of her life running and sniffing. On this particular evening, she acted like she was mortified to cross the street and enter the park. As we crossed the street and came up to the area where the basketball courts are located and the start of the trail that goes around and through the park, my dog was practically being dragged as she resisted wanting to continue. After much effort, I finally got her to cooperate and begin the walk. I started walking east toward the Oz Garden, a route that is my usual when I come here to walk or jog. As we walked toward the garden, I noticed that many of the birds you usually hear in the park were all but silent, and that the only noise you could hear was the usual noise from the surrounding neighborhood city streets. As we rounded the sidewalk to head south with the garden to my left, I heard what could only be described as the flapping of wings. I really didn't want to give it a second thought, as I assumed it would be some passing Canadian geese that I've seen in the park recently. As we came toward the clearing, where you would find the baseball fields, something caught my eye, and what I saw still scares the crap out of me. I saw a large man, probably 7 feet or taller, standing on the ground. It was solid black, but what really stood out were the large, and I do mean large, pair of wings that were folded behind him. These wings stood taller than the man by at least 1.5 feet and jutted out of his back. I could not see his face, as it had its face turned away from me and probably didn't notice me at first. It finally turned and noticed me, and I saw the bright ruby-red eyes that appeared to glow from within. It was at this time that it turned and faced me, and I got to see what it really looked like. It was about 7 feet tall, and instead of clothes, it looked like a giant half-man, half-bird kind of thing. This thing stared at me for about 15 seconds, which felt like an eternity, and then, in a loud whoosh, it unfurled its wings and screeched really loud and jetted into the air. These wings looked almost bat-like and were at least 10 feet across from tip to tip. I felt like this thing could see right through me, read me. It knew what I was thinking, like it could stare right into my very soul. It was the most terrified I have ever been in my life. It rose into the air like a bullet, and I heard it screech once more before losing it from my view as it rose above the trees and possibly even the buildings. It was at that time that I realized that I had yet to scream or even react in any way. I was just numb from my head to my toes. I finished my walk early and walked home, all the while trying to see if I could see it again once I got to the street. It was the scariest thing I have ever experienced, and it led me to look up giant mutant birds online and eventually came to sites talking about similar sightings that other people had had and eventually to where I could post and report my own sighting. I don't want to think that I am crazy. I'm just a normal person who had a weird and strange experience. I do not abuse drugs or take any kind of hallucinogens or anything like that. I know what I saw was real, and that I saw it in Oz Park in Chicago, Illinois. I don't want publicity at all. I just want to tell my story, and to warn others who might jog or walk the trails of Oz Park. I never felt like I was in any real kind of danger if I did not provoke it, but I felt that this creature could have ripped me limb from limb if I had approached it or threatened it in any way. Maybe it was passing through like the Canadian geese do when they are migrating. Either way, I hope that we never meet face to face again. Investigators go on to say that this witness is an educated professional who has lived in the Oz Park neighborhood for over 10 years, and after some basic questions, appears to be a credible witness with no need to propagate a hoax. When asked why no picture was taken of the creature, the witness stated that she was frozen in place and that the thought of grabbing her phone, which was in her pocket, never occurred to her. She feels that part of the fear she felt was due to some unknown influence the creature might have had over her, a defense mechanism she hypothesized. The next report occurred at 2 a.m. on April 16, 2017. I arrived for work at 2 a.m. at the Chicago International Produce Market, just off Damon. As I walked across the parking lot, a bunch of guys, about 4 or 5 of them, were staring up at the sky. The witness stated, "I looked up and saw the biggest freaking owl I have ever seen. I'm 6 foot 2 inches, and I'm guessing this thing was at least a foot taller than me. It was completely black except for it having bright yellowish reddish eyes like a cat. It stood there for a minute or two staring at everyone before shooting up into the sky and disappearing. It made everyone feel very uneasy, and only took off after some guys threw rocks at it. It had wings on it like an owl, only bigger, and you could hear it flap those wings when it took off. It made this sound as it took off and flew away that sounded like a truck's brakes when they are burned out. It flew up and flew a wide circle, making that sound once more, and then flew off in the direction of the Stevenson Expressway. We stood around and looked for it for a few minutes, but it never came back. I'm reporting this because there is no way this was an owl. It stood upright like a man, just really, really tall. I don't want to discuss this with anyone, and would prefer to remain anonymous. I don't imagine anyone would believe me anyway. One of the guys I work with, who also saw this thing, said that it made him feel very uneasy, like a scared kid, and he was glad someone threw a rock at it to make it fly away. The following sighting took place on April 27th at 7:30 p.m. I was out with my son by the banks of the Little Calumet on the northwestern side of Hedgewick Park at a spot where we have had some success catching fish in the past. It's located by the Trestle Bridge that runs east to west over near 130th Street. It's a spot that takes a little effort to get to, but it has had some payoffs in catching some medium-sized catfish. It was about 7:30 p.m. and we were packing up our gear when we heard something that sounded like train brakes when the train is slowing down. However, there was no train going by at that moment. On this day, it was quiet with the occasional sound of trucks or cars going about. We heard the sound again and saw something fly from our left toward some trees on the other side of the river. We thought it looked like a giant bird, but it was solid black. Within a minute, we heard the sound again, and this thing flew straight up and over the Trestle Bridge and headed off down the river. This thing was unlike any bird we have seen in our lives. It was solid black and had to be about the size of a full-grown man. It had wings that must have been 10 feet from tip to tip. It flew up and out of sight within seconds. We couldn't really get many details, as this thing flew like a literal bat out of hell, and was still on the other side of the river. We stood there and watched it fly away. I was just blown away, but then my son piped up and said he had read about some giant bat sightings that have occurred in Chicago lately. Maybe this was one of them. We packed up our gear and got the hell out of there as fast as we could. We didn't want this thing to come back and see us there, as we were not supposed to be there fishing in the first place. Later that night, my son showed me the websites where the reports were listed, and that led me to report this sighting. I'm sorry that I couldn't give you more details on this thing, but frankly, I thank my lucky stars that we weren't close enough to see any details. This last eyewitness account that I'm going to share with you took place on May 19th, 2017. I was out at the breakwater with my best friend and her boyfriend. We were waiting for my boyfriend to finish helping his dad tie their boat to the dock after helping bring the boat to the marina for the summer. We were standing on the shore by some picnic tables, waiting on James to meet us there. We were talking when we heard this loud screech. It sounded completely out of this world, and after a couple of seconds we heard another one, only louder and higher pitched than the first one. We looked around, thinking we had heard an animal in distress and if it needed help. That's when we saw this large bat fly into our view. It was black and came from the direction of the bridge that holds up the Lakeshore Drive. It flew low and then shot up into the air as it came over the water. We noticed one of the Coast Guard helicopters was flying over the water at about the same time, but we're not sure if it saw this thing as it kept on flying toward the Adler Planetarium. This thing flew a large circle and cried out again, and almost instantly it was joined by another large bat. These things were big and stood out against the sky. They flew figure eights around each other. It looked like they were dancing in a strange sort of way. It was actually quite beautiful, considering how freaking strange it was. About that time, my boyfriend walked up on us and scared the living bejesus out of us. Both myself and my friend screamed, and I think those large bats heard us, because they screeched back at each other and both flew down toward the water. It looked like they were going to slam into the water, and at the last second, they pulled up and flew toward, and I'm assuming under, the bridge and out of sight. We ran toward the railing to look down the river and saw nothing else. This entire encounter lasted about 1.5 to 2 minutes. It was scary only because we didn't know what the hell they were, but it looked like they were interested in each other and not us. We can't be the only ones to see it, as the Riverwalk and the pier were full of joggers and people on that particular day. These eyewitness accounts are very compelling, and I want to let you guys know that there have been multiple other reports of people seeing this creature, but I just wanted to touch on a few of them today. I personally believe that people are seeing something unexplained, and I think it would be a disservice to ignore these claims and the history surrounding similar sightings in the past. I don't think that people need to be fearful or assume that something bad is going to happen, but I do think that it's important for all of us to remain vigilant. As always, I want to know what you guys think and if you've experienced a similar encounter. I'd like to thank everyone for joining me today, and I want to encourage you to visit our forums on mythicradio.com. There you'll find all the topics that we discuss here on the podcast. Feel free to ask questions, post your own experiences, and start new topics on what interests you.